right. Hello, everyone. It's 1 o'clock in the morning here in Southern Australia and or Western Australia, actually. And we're welcoming you all to the fourth week of the Soil Nutrition Conference, our 12th year. This week I'm the presenter, and our topic is a treaty on nutrient density. So very excited to be presenting this this conversation this week. We're at the beginning of a global process. It's Wednesday here, and starting tomorrow on Thursday, outside of Melbourne, we'll be beginning the first of a series of listening sessions across 5 continents between now and the end of November. So we're at the beginning of a wonderful tour and trip of engaging the globe around this conversation and strategy about nutrient density. I'm really looking forward to presenting to you this week where we're at, what the vision is, what the concepts are. This draft treaty. This is the first time we'll ever be presenting this, so you're part of a really yeah, this is it. This is the first time ever. Looking forward to sharing it. All right, and so Shauna's running the computer for me, running the slides. I think I'll jump right into it. And Su Kahumbu from Kenya, who is going to be hosting one of our global listening sessions, will be stepping in an hour, and she'll be the panelist who's interviewing me around this question and topic. All right. Just waiting for these slides to get ready here. Beautiful. Okay, well, as you all know, I'm the founder and the executive director of the Bionutrient Food Association. We're an educational nonprofit founded in 2010 with a mission to increase quality in the food supply. We also have a educational organization, educational wing called the Bionutrient Institute, and that Bionutrient Institute is the aspect of the organization that's been doing all of our research now for a number of years into these questions of nutrient density, nutrient variation, what causes it, soil health, the potential to have meters that assess it, etc. So again, this presentation is on our treaty on nutrient density and what we're presenting for our series of global listening sessions in preparation for that. Again, yeah, the BFA is a organization we're around since 2010, and our mission is increasing quality in the food supply. Our history is started off as an educational organization. We weren't doing much research. We were really working with growers to help them understand how to work more well with nature. This comes from my background as a organic farmer, struggling for many years with things like pest pressure, disease pressure, failure to thrive, limited economic viability. And really, it was when I got exposed to the ecosystem that was developed by Charles Walters starting in the early 1970s called Acres USA that I was exposed to sort of a suite of different insights from permaculture to biochemistry to agroecology to the quantum and a whole bunch in between that helped augment my management practices as a farmer, effectively, like I said, how to work with nature, how to understanding how nature evolved things to work, how it was that plants had been growing for hundreds of millions of years without the use of fertilizer and insecticides, fungicides, etc. And when you, as a farmer, are able to do that, identify what nature needs to function more well, provide those aspects, what happens is your cost of production goes down, ecosystem function improves, quality in the form of flavor, aroma, shelf life improves, economic viability improves. So the initial work of the organization, starting in 2010, was really about education. We taught courses, held workshops, started this conference. You see here in this graphic some of the people who've spoken in this conference over the past, I think we started it in 2011, maybe it's 2012. So it's been quite a number of years. For those who are unaware, as a side note, um, this all presentations from all years from this conference have been recorded and are available for free on our YouTube channel. So there's an absolute wealth of collected wisdom from a number of really amazing individuals that we've got available for any grower on the planet for free. One thing that we found when we were teaching these courses, farmers would come, not just farmers, gardeners, growers of all scales would come. They'd be exposed to, some of these different concepts, and principles, they'd do some experimentation. They'd start finding that things were working more well for them, and they'd, through word of mouth, share these insights with their friends. Sometimes their friends were far away, and I'd get invited to come and give a course, 2 states away, 4 states away, etc. And so as the word spread and we began to be teaching these courses in more and more broad geographic areas, different soil types, different climate zones, different scales of operation, different crops, and it seemed like pretty much wherever you went, the more you were able to work with nature, the better the nutritional caliber of the food, the better the flavor, the better the aroma, the better the soil health, the better the economic viability. And so we had this idea that if this was true, that working more well with nature seemed to cause a lot of things to function more well, maybe this is the kind of thing we should try to bring to scale. There's a lot of problems in today's world. We can look at the ecological dynamics, which are not optimal. We can look at the human health dynamics, which are not optimal. And our thought was, if we could bring these practices, this understanding, these results, really, because it's a full suite of practices, these results to a larger scale, the world might be able to be a better place. And so that's when we started the work of the Bionutrient Institute. Here we can see in 2017 we really began that work systemically. In 2016 we sort of designed the concept, which was that if people who buy food had the ability to choose of the options in front of them, that which was most nutritious and leave on the shelf, which was least nutritious, that would incentivize those working in the supply chain to focus more on nutrition as opposed to volume. And most of us know these days that at least in the market, you get paid by volume and weight. You don't get paid by nutritional caliber. And so really the grand vision here with the work around nutrient density is to shift the incentive in the supply chain to focus on nutrition instead of volume. So we had an idea that could be done through a handheld flash of light meter. If you could effectively go to your point of purchase with something in your hand and non-invasively actually measure it, that would give you the confidence that you knew which one was better, which one was worse. All the certification labels that are out there, the claims, all the marketing, stuff doesn't actually connect to nutritional caliber. It connects to local or certain practices or things like that. It didn't seem like there actually was a direct connection there with nutrition. So we had three basic questions that we thought needed to be answered in the affirmative for this vision to be a plausible one. The first question was, how big is the scale of nutrient variation in food? Our thought was that it might be actually quite significant. When we did go and talk to researchers at universities and things, they said maybe it's 5%, 10%, but probably not that big. Our thought was maybe it was bigger than that. Second question was, what causes nutritional variation? we were working with farmers who had been on the same land for years, decades, multiple decades. Their soil hasn't, they weren't on a different farm. They were using the same varieties, the same genetics that they've been using for a long time, and they were seeing dramatic differences in their crops. So the question is, what caused that what we thought was a significant nutrient variation? Our thesis was it wasn't the soil type, it wasn't the genetics, it was something more along the lines of soil health that was the causal factor behind this nutrient variation, we presumed. And the third question, of course, was, is it possible to build a handheld, consumer-priced flash of light nutrient meter that you can bring to the store, bring to the farmer's market, bring to the any point of purchase, wherever it is, and assess in real time. So if those three things were true, if nutrient by something like variations in soil health, and if you could build handheld meters, then the thought was we really could have a quite positive impact in changing the world through this strategy of empowering people to choose at point of purchase. So to do all that, we started in 2017. The first thing we did was build a meter to engineer a handheld consumer price meter that could be used. In 2018, we built our first lab, and we had people send in samples of carrots and spinach from across the United States, from grocery stores, from farms, from their gardens, from their CSA bags. We wanted to survey and see what was the variation of nutrient levels in food. In 2019, we set up our second lab. That was out in California at Chico State University. And that year we were able to go up to 6 crops. And the farmers that were sending in the crops, we had them send in the soil the crops grew in at multiple depths, as well as answer a whole bunch of management questions like, what was your fertility program? How did you prepare the soil? What was the genetics? What were the other environmental conditions of weather? And did you do foliar sprays or side dressing? Did you inoculate? If you irrigated, how often would you irrigate, with what? We're trying to capture as many of the environmental conditions data as possible, so we could overlay the nutrient levels in the food, the metrics in the soil, and the causal factors. With every one of these samples of crop that got sent in, the first thing we did was flashlight it with the meter, and then we ran it through the lab to assess these different dynamics. In 2020, our third lab was set up in France and Europe. Sean, do you mind moving to the next slide? Yeah, here you can see the data that we, just a sort of a snapshot from 2020 of the sort of the scale of the work we were doing. On the right-hand side, you can see all the different crops that were sampled. You can see the number of samples for each crop that we got. The total there, 3,800 samples that 1 year of crops. In total, through this process, it was almost 10,000 samples that we brought in. So quite a significant number of crops across more than 25 different crop types. At the bottom on the left, you can see what some of the metrics were that we measured in the crops. Actually, there's a couple of pieces that are missing there with that slide. Antioxidants and polyphenols and proteins seem to have been cut off of the slide. On the right-hand side, you can see some of the metrics that were measured in the soil. Again, it looks like we've got organic matter and pH and things like that they're missing. They seem to have been cut off in the slide. But on the graphic, you can see shows every green icon is one of the farmers that was sending in the samples. Again, they were sending in samples in triplicate, so they would pull 3 carrots or 3 cucumbers from the field and then take the soil that was growing underneath each of those 3 and send that in triplicate at multiple depths, and answer the management questions. The orange icons that are on that slide are citizen scientists. Those are people that were going to the grocery store, going to the farmer's market, taking samples from their CSA bag and sending them in. as well. So we were not only getting crops from farms, we were also surveying the supply chain. We wanted to really see if we can get a diverse set of samples that characterize the variation in crops, nutrient levels in crops that were available to people. So yeah, multiple years, multiple continents, hundreds of farms, dozens of crops, types of crops, 10,000 samples. So really, I think quite a significant data set to begin to answer some of these questions. These next few slides now are looking at the variation we found in these crops. The first one here on the left is sulfur in carrots. You can see, I think it's, what is it? 8.41 milligrams per 100 grams is the number on the left, and 33.19 on the right. So that's a 4-to-1 variation, as in, the ones on the right had 4 times as much sulfur as the ones on the left. So, and you can see with that graph that the red is sort of the if you had to separate from the lowest to the highest, break it into a 1 to 100 range, all the samples in the red would be 0 to 20, the orange would be 20 to 40, the yellow would be 40 to 60. And so we can see really the vast majority of the samples we collected over these years were relatively low as far as the amount of sulfur in them in relation to what's possible. The peak of the curve there would then, effectively be in the 22nd percentile. On the right, you see phosphorus, 11 to 93. That's an 8-to-1 variation. So you'd have to eat 8 of the ones on the left to get as much sulfur as a phosphorus as if you ate one of the ones on the right. 8-to-1. That's not a small variation. The peak of the curve there is in the 27th percentile. So yeah, the light green and the dark green, that's 60, 70, 80, 90 out of 100. Not many samples in that upper range. Here we have antioxidants and polyphenols. Antioxidants and polyphenols are much more complex, sort of really powerfully health-giving compounds. We got 4.92 to 195 on antioxidants is the range. That's a 40-to-1 variation. So you'd have to eat 40 of the ones on the right. Sorry, of the ones on the left to get as much as if you had one of the ones on the right. That's a dramatic variation, 40-to-1. And then on the polyphenols, 2.34 to 49.75. That's a more than 20-to-1 variation. And you can see the peak of the curve there is in the 7th percentile. So these are the compounds that we, as animals, with our instinct, experience as flavor and aroma. The things that are the most health-giving, the most anti-cancer, anti-diabetes, anti-heart disease, anti-osteoporosis, those significant chronic diseases that are becoming more and more prevalent in humanity. These compounds like polyphenols, terpenoids, alkaloids are the things that are most health beneficial and reversing those things. So you can see this one, polyphenols, the peak of the curve is in the 7th percentile. It drops off pretty quick, and there's almost nothing there at the higher end. This seems to be the nature of the supply chain, nature of what we've got access to. If you buy food from others, pretty much anywhere. Okay, these next couple slides are looking again at carrots. I don't think I said we have graphs like this for more than 20 different crops. This isn't just the carrots that we saw this on. For anybody that wants to go to our website, bionutrientinstitute.org, there's a number of reports there, a number of graphs, and so you can tease this out and you can see what we found across a whole bunch of different types of crops. But effectively, this is the pattern we saw everywhere. So on the left, we see genetics, different varieties. We've got Napoli, we've got Bolero, we've got Nantes, Mokum. These are different varieties of carrots. You can see with Napoli, you can have some samples that are relatively quite poor or low in nutrient levels, and some that are actually quite high. Bolero the same, Nantes the same, Mokum the same. We don't seem to see any meaningful connection between levels of nutrients and the variety of the crop. You can put a Mokum into one soil and get high levels of nutrients, or a different soil and get low levels of nutrients. We found this across the board. Genetics does not seem to be a predictor of nutrient levels in food. On the right-hand side, we see the nutrient levels by soil type, by climate region. This is USDA climate regions. We've got Northeast, East, North, Central, Southeast, Central, Northwest, West, Southwest. These are different regions of the United States. Some of them are hot and dry. Some of them are cold and dry. Some are hot and wet. Some are cold and wet. Some are clay soils. Some are sandy soils. We're really seeing pretty much across the board. It doesn't seem to matter where you plant your seeds. It seems to matter much more the nature of the soil those seeds were planted in. You can do a good job anywhere, and you can do a bad job anywhere. That seems to be pretty much the pattern we're finding across the board. This slide is looking at the point of purchase, or where you got the samples from, the crops from. On top, we have from the farm. The next one there is the store. The one after that is the garden. And the final one is the farmer's market. So for those people who think that if they go to the local farm or they pull the carrots out of their garden, they're going to be better, that's not what we're seeing. We're seeing that same dramatic variation with not many samples being, of high caliber across all points of purchase, all places where you can be, procuring your food from. Yeah, sample source does not seem to be a connector or a causal factor in nutrient levels in food. On the right, by practice or by certification level, on top we see certified organic, a bunch of reds, a lot of oranges, a ton of yellows, not many dark greens. Cover crops, very similar. A lot of reds, people who use cover crops, bunch of oranges, bunch of yellows, only one dark green. No-till is next. Not quite so many reds, still a bunch of oranges, bunch of yellows, just 3 dark greens. Tillage, not much different. Organic not certified is the next one. Looks pretty similar. Decent amount of reds, more oranges and yellows, just 2 dark greens. Reference and none, that would be stores that are not organic, where you're just going to the grocery store. All we know is it's just a carrot off the shelf. Actually not looking too bad. Not worse than the other things. Certainly not worse than organic or certified organic, or people that are no-till or using cover crops. In fact, actually it's fatter further to the right? So there's more samples in the yellow than there are in the orange or the red. Which you could say the average means that you could get better samples there at the store. The next one is going to be very uncomfortable for a lot of people in today's sort of current food movement conversation. That's regenerative. Look, it's definitely fatter over in the orange than it is in the yellow. That might be something that would cause a few people to stop and think for a second. I propose humility is an appropriate response to some of these data points. If you're a producer, for that we've got biodynamic and local. Local actually looks like it's the best choice of all. But you can see there's a red and there's a dark green, but they're evenly spread. You're not going to guarantee a superior quality from local. The one thing that we have found, which I'm sorry we don't have a graph here for, we're working on that paper to get it published, and we'll have a graphic for this. The one thing that we did find that seemed to connect to nutrient levels in food was the level of life in the soil. It really did seem that function of the microbiome was a thing that was most connected to the quality of food. This next slide here is looking at the meter. Do you mind moving the slide, Shauna? There we go. Beautiful. Okay. This is a picture of the Bionutrient meter that we were able to release in 2021. This was a handheld, consumer-priced flash of light meter. It's Bluetooth to a smartphone. This is our functioning proof of concept, and I'll sort of emphasize that point, proof of concept. This is not a meter measuring nutrient density. This is a meter measuring individual nutrients, as you see on the graphic here with the antioxidants and the bricks. Depending on what the crop was, we had calibrations where we could say, look, for carrots, this meter can, measure the level of antioxidants in these carrots, or for zucchini, it can measure the level of polyphenols. Yes, you can build a handheld, consumer-priced flash of light nutrient meter that can assess levels of nutrients in food in real time anywhere. That was what we accomplished with this meter. This is not a meter that is measuring nutrient density, because actually, and this is the whole point of the conversation, we don't have a definition for nutrient density. So, but we're able to make a few hundred of these meters and ship them around the world, and prove this is a possible thing to do. So this brings us to our next question. What is nutrient density? There does seem to be a dramatic variation of nutrient levels in food, but how would you be able to say this is better, this is worse? This is 20 out of 100, this is 40 out of 100, this is 60 out of 100. That's really what we think we're trying to accomplish in this deeper nutrient density definition process. So what we have here is now a series of slides which talk about the work we did starting with beef. This is the first crop we worked to define nutrient density, and we started this project in 2021. You can see here on this slide what our thesis was, our hypothesis, what we proposed would be what we would find, and that was that if cows were eating what they evolved to eat, what they ate in nature, which is a broad diversity of plants, they would be more nutritious than if they ate concentrated grain, which is what a lot of the beef in the supermarket shelf right now ate for the last number of months of its life. Next slide. Oh, this one doesn't look quite in focus, but yeah, the sort of the experimental design for how we were going to approach this process was that we wanted to ask nature. We wanted to engage in what's called original research. We don't have our finger on the scale. We don't, think we know what the nutrients are per se. We think there are certain nutrients that are at certain levels and ratios which could, be our definition of 1 to 100 in food. But we're going to engage an original research style of assessment of engagement. I'm not going to say we think it's this compound or we think it's this nutrient. We're going to sort of do a broad survey. So we had the producers send in a steak from 3 different animals. We started off looking at over 800 different nutrients in each of these steaks. By the end of the project, we were actually down to about 100. But elements and enzymes and vitamins and fatty acids and polyphenols and terpenoids and a whole bunch of different types of nutrients. We had the farmers send in the manure so we could look at the microbiome of the animals. We were looking at, I think, over 200 different species of microbes and multiple kingdoms. We were also able to assess, what was in what the plants were the animals were eating from that stool sample. Simultaneously, we had the farmers send in, they go out and send in a sample of what the animals were eating, whether it was forage, whether it was a polyculture pasture or a monoculture pasture or total mixed ration. They sent that in for assessment. They sent in the soil that fodder grew in, so we could assess those dynamics. We asked a whole bunch of management questions about how the animals were raised. And then with a subset of the meat, that was fed to humans. So human health trials, feed people this beef and see what happens to their bodies. feed them that beef, see what happens to their bodies, and as well, some of the people were fed Impossible Burger, so a fake meat. If you at least in the United States, um, if you look on the back of a package of meat or fake meat, it says just exactly the same nutrients, same amount of vitamin D, same amount of protein, same amount of fat, same amount of iron. According to the packaging on the label, these things are all completely uniform. Um, when you look more deeply, if you take those things to a lab and you look at a bunch of different nutrients, you see they're actually quite different. And so the question was, if you feed the grass-fed beef and the corn-fed beef and the Impossible Burger to humans, what happens to their bodies? Do they respond uniformly, similarly, or do they have different responses? And so this was basically the experimental design for how we did beef, and sort of to foreshadow what we're about to talk about here, is effectively the model that we want to engage in our proposed definition of nutrient density and a whole bunch of other crops. This slide is missing Australia, it's missing Asia, it's missing much of South America. But you can see a bunch of dots here from where samples came in. You can't see the dots for the samples that came in from South America. You can't see the dots for the samples that came in from Australia. We had samples from four continents, a broad and diverse range of soil types, climate zones, and fodder types, as well as genetics from the animals. So a nice diversity in the sample set. Here's just a couple graphs on omega-3, omega-6. This is the preliminary data because we're still in the final stages of defining it with the Bionutrient Definition Standards Board. But for those who have heard about omega-3 and omega-6, there's a ratio that we would like to see in our bodies that seems to correlate with overall well-being. And in many cases, when you have elevated levels of omega-6 in your body, that connects to inflammation, which is a causal factor in all kinds of chronic illness. What we're seeing here is that when cows are eating grain, what's in their meat is actually much higher levels of omega-6. You can see a dramatic range there from 3 or 4 to 1 all the way up to 14 to 1. So dramatic variation. But in the grass-fed, really almost all the samples were in that 1 to 1 to 2 to 1 range. There's a few outliers that after we asked a few questions to the people who sent in the samples later, they told us actually this was somebody who said this was grass-fed beef, but then again, all cows eat grass at some point in their life, so you can honestly say that almost all beef is grass-fed. But we can see here that those few outliers sure look like somebody made a claim that wasn't true. That cow was not 100% grass-fed. It did not finish its life eating only grass. It was probably eating a whole bunch of something else. So yeah, this is one of the metrics that we think will likely be part of our set of biomarkers that is a definition of nutrient density in beef. And you can see here dramatic variations based on what the animals are eating. Okay, this slide looks at the connection between diversity of diet, diversity of spectrum of species of plants in the diet, and that omega-6, omega-3 ratio. Very, very strong connections here between diversity and nutritional caliber. If there's a short answer from all the work we did in our beef project, from what we think, again, we haven't published the results yet, and so we can't say with formal confidence, but at this moment, after this many years in, with all the data we've looked at, it sure looks like the greater the diversity of species in the paddock where the animals are eating, the better the health, the well-being, and the nutritional caliber of that meat. Okay, so now we go on to the formal topic of this presentation, this global treaty. The idea here is we take the insights from this work we've done from 2017 to present, and we bring it to now many species of food, types of food. We think we've got a model for how we can define nutrient density in a crop. We've done it with beef. Now, how about cucumbers and rice and potatoes and blueberries and apples and lamb and milk and eggs? We spent 4 years figuring out how to do it with beef, but now we've figured out, we think, how to do it. So our proposal is that we can do this simultaneously on a number of crops. And we really want to take these insights and instead of having, a bunch of samples from North America and some from other continents, really go to all 6 continents where, humans are living and fairly and evenly sample from them all and categorically once and for all begin to define nutrient density in food for the planet. This treaty we're proposing is effectively our plan of action. And the idea is that, we at the Bionutrient Food Association and the Bionutrient Institute have been leading this conversation, and we're quite happy to have done so, but we're a fairly small team. And the implication, the repercussions of this work, we think are quite significant. And so before stepping into this, this next phase of really trying to do a number of crops simultaneously, the thought is it probably would be good for us to stop, take a deep breath, and go out and around to the rest of the world and get insight, get guidance, get feedback from others, from other continents, from other backgrounds, to ensure that the way we're envisioning doing this makes sense. There's many humans on this planet who come from many different backgrounds and have many different perspectives. The implications of what we're doing is so significant. Let's take a minute and really make sure that what we're trying to accomplish makes sense for everybody. So that's the basic framing behind where we're at, what we're trying to accomplish. Next slide. Yeah, this slide basically refers to the fact that even though nutrient density is a term that's getting a lot more recognition, interest, momentum, buzz built around it, there is no formal definition for it. And our thought is, after watching what happened to sustainable and organic and seems to be happening to regenerative, you get a concept that's started by a few people who have maybe somewhat of a clear vision, but as it gets momentum, different people feel ownership. They begin to have it mean different things for different people. You get multiple different standards that are established, different certifications. They don't align. Sometimes greenwashing occurs, that the value of the term begins to diminish, and yeah, the potential for that to have been brought together and established a common understanding around the planet was not accomplished. So in our vision, there's a desire to establish a 1 to 100 scale for all food. We want to be able to say about this carrot or that cucumber or that blueberry or this rice or that wheat or that potato or that milk, this sits at 20 out of 100, or that sits at 40 out of 100. If we can establish a scale where anyone anywhere on the planet could know the quality of the food they're looking at, and if you've got multiple choices, you got 5 choices of tomatoes. That one's 10 out of 100, that one's 15, that one's 20, that one's 30, and that one's 60. If you could know that, if you could know of the 5 choices in front of you, one's a 60, one's a 30, and the rest are below that, our thought is you might make choices for yourself and your family to choose that 60. But how do you define that? This is our deep hope, is that we can actually do that. All right, so yeah, this is the process. Next slide. This is a term one of our staff people came up with. NUDIN. I'm not quite sure I'm in support of it, but as a shorthand for nutrient density. What are we going to call this? Are we going to call it the bionutrient level? what's the term for the thing? The level is those 1 to 100. Nutrient density is kind of a long, multi-syllable term. And this is, from my perspective, part of this conversation. What do we call it? The nutrient density level, the bionutrient level, Adam's proposed Newton level when putting this slide together. Yeah, we don't know. And this is part of what we're completely open to people's suggestions on. Next slide. Okay, yeah, this just says that the beef project took 4 years. And what we're proposing going forward with this process is a 3-phase process. We think it'll take about 2.5 years. And to define nutrient density in 20 crops, we think it'll cost $25 million US or thereabouts. Yeah, so we propose in 2026, we will start this process. We think it'll probably take about $5 million in the 2026 calendar year to go through the process of experimental design and then begin the collection of all the samples. We're figuring a 12-month period of time for sample collection because we want to be getting samples from the Northern Hemisphere and the Southern Hemisphere, and different crops have different growing seasons. So yeah, there's going to be a extended period of actually bringing in the samples from around the world to have them assessed. 2027 would be the conclusion of the sample collection process, and then we'll be running everything through the labs, testing the nutrients, testing the microbiome, testing the soil, doing the human health trials, etc. And then that would, probably get us towards the end of 2027. We'll begin the process of digesting the data, looking for patterns, etc. in 2028, and then working to come up with the definitions of nutrient density, do that digestion of the data, and then finally get all those standards published before the end of 2028. So this is our proposed timeline. Again, what we're trying to do here is not build meters to test nutrient density. We're trying to engage a global, open, collaborative process to define nutrient density. The conclusion of this process in our mind is the publication of this definition standard in a highly reputable peer-reviewed journal. Then we hope that people who have companies who have built meters would be inspired to build instruments to test nutrient density. And we're not envisioning making money selling meters. We're envisioning being the nonprofit, the NGO, the sort of the civil society community that's holding integrity around the definition. So this brings us to our listening sessions. As I said at the beginning, we have a series of listening sessions scheduled around the planet, starting here in Australia on Thursday. We've got three sessions in Australia going through the end of the month. Then we'll have a number of them in Europe in the beginning of October. We'll have a few in North America in the end of October and the beginning of November. Then we're going to go through South America and run a few there, and hopefully finish up in Africa with probably 3 or 4 or 5 sessions in Africa by the end of November. Yeah, okay, that slide effectively refers to that. This is a QR code for anybody who's interested in engaging the process. If you're old-fashioned and you don't like to use QR codes, the website is bionutrientinstitute.org/treaty. This is where the treaty is housed. This is where people who can engage, they can sign up. They can say, I want to be part of this, offer their insight, share their insights, be publicly acknowledged, etc. So now we're going to move on to the actual treaty itself and its appendices. Yeah, and of course, if you want to support our work, obviously we're a nonprofit educational organization. We run on donations. These are some things and ways in which you can be in support of the efforts of the organization. All right. that's the overarching framing slideshow. And now I'm really excited for the first time ever to share the treaty itself. And you all should have gotten an email with a link to this ahead of time. Hopefully some of you have had a chance to read it and look at it. And yeah, we're gonna walk you through the treaty as it stands. And we're calling it a draft because the concept is it's not final. We go through the process of going around the world and listening, not just at these sessions in person around the planet, but also online, so people can review it and look at it. Whether it's a you know a live webinar kind of format, or if it's you know asynchronous, anybody at any point in time from any background can go onto the website, can download the document, can read it, and if they want to be associated, they put their name in, say, hey, I want to be part of this process, and offer insight, offer guidance. You can just say, hey, great, good job. Put my name on the list of people who support you. What we're really looking for actually are people who say, this is nice, but how about doing that differently? How about here's a suggestion, maybe here's something you haven't thought of. That's really what we want to be accomplishing in these next, you know, couple of months of discernment. So, all right, this is the opening page. What you'll see on the if you go to the website and download the draft document. All right. Yeah, this is the first page. We've got 10 articles, a purpose, definitions, coordinating entity, guiding principles, achievements and momentum, objectives, global participation, funding milestones, experimental design, and implementation and publication. So here we are formally laying out in writing how we expect or propose this process to occur. And then finally, there's a number of addendums subsequent to that. All right. So we want to go to Article 1, the purpose. Oh, there we go. Up one, I think. There we go. Purpose. The purpose of this treaty is to formalize a global coordinated effort to develop empirical standards for nutrient density in food, expressed via a 1 to 100 scale based on key biomarker levels and ratios in whole foodstuffs. These standards will serve as the basis for an empirical definition of nutritional caliber that can be used for instrument calibration for non-invasive and invasive assessments, which can empower transparent communication throughout the supply chain to support consumer choice of best nutritional quality at point of purchase, which will incentivize agricultural practices that preference nutrition as an output. All right, that's the general purpose. Again, here's our thoughts. We welcome insight. Anybody who wants to get on the website, give us your email, say who you are, and say, I think you should add this. I think this is a piece that you should put in. You forgot this aspect. All right, definitions. Nutrient density, the relative concentration and diversity of essential nutrients and beneficial compounds, i.e. elements, vitamins, phytonutrients, in a given food item in comparison with others of the same type. So we're thinking of nutrient density as a range, as a scale. It's not that you are nutrient dense or aren't nutrient dense, it's that it's a continuum. Everything sits somewhere in a continuum. Biomarkers are the compounds, the nutrients we think will be the things we use to develop that 1 to 100 scale. A biomarker is a measurable substance whose presence or ratio is indicative of nutritional quality, health benefit, or ecological integrity. 1 to 100 scale, it says Kittredge scale in there. It doesn't say bionutrient level, which is my proposed name for this. A standardized metric by which food of a given category, i.e. spinach, wheat, or beef, can be rated for nutrient density based on empirical assessment. So this is the foundational framing of what we want to accomplish. coordinating entity. We are proposing at the BI to be that coordinating entity. Obviously, this is up for discussion. If the consensus says somebody else should be running this project, great. This is the opportunity for everybody to say that. But what we've got here is the Bionutrient Institute, having conducted foundational research in this area since 2017, shall serve as the primary coordinating entity for this effort. In coordination with treaty signatories, the BI will convene global stakeholders, raise the funding, oversee experimental design, manage sample and data collection and analysis, publish conclusions in highly regarded peer-reviewed journals, and hold all metadata in an open source platform. So this is our the mission or the charter of what we would presume to do as part of this process. Theory of change, I think this is a really important one. That sort of speaks to the broad philosophical framework of what we're trying to accomplish. This treaty is premised on the following theses. 1, nutritional variation is profound. Levels of nutrients in crops of the same, that's a typo, type may vary by 5x to 20x or more. This is part of why we do this, is to find the flaws in the document. Number 2, production influences nutrition. Environmental conditions, management practices, fertility regimes, epigenetics, and microbiome dynamics can significantly affect nutrient profiles in food. This is our thesis. This is not necessarily what some of the conventional agronomic research institutions would propose, but we think this is the case. Number 3, assessment can be non-invasive. Instruments using methods such as spectroscopy can assess nutrient density in food in real time throughout the food supply chain. That means somebody who's at the point of purchase buying, the wholesaler, the retailer, the packer, the agronomist, anywhere in the supply chain. Our thought is that instruments can be built to assess this relative nutritional caliber. 4, standards can be established. Each crop or food type can have a nutrient density score defined by levels and ratios of a short list of biomarkers that correlate with the overall balance of nutrients in that crop. This is the basic premise. Health and ecology are linked. Number 5, forms of foods that cause relatively improved human health outcomes are produced in manners that have similarly beneficial impacts on the ecosystem they are produced in. Again, this is one of our foundational principles we think is the case. The point of science is you actually let the data guide you. Maybe that's completely wrong. And maybe it's entirely wrong, but this is part of what we think is actually going on here. 6, quality is sensory. Increased and improved flavor, aroma, and satiety. I'm not sure how to pronounce that one. What causes you to feel satiated? I'll say it that way. Flavor, aroma, and satiety are sensory experiences that correlate with higher nutritional quality in food. We can have metrics that are based on machines and labs and numbers, but we also, if those things don't correlate with our animal instinct experiences like flavor and aroma and feeling satiated, I would say perhaps we have a bad definition. 7, consumers will choose higher quality. Our thesis is that when presented with trustworthy and easily interpreted information, consumers will choose options that are nutritionally beneficial for themselves and their families. I've only tested this out by speaking to thousands and thousands of people about this, and the general impulse is people say, yes, if I could choose between the 3 different options of potatoes on the shelf and one I knew was much better than the others nutritionally, I would take it. 8, markets can transform food systems. Economic incentives cascade through supply chains with the choice for higher quality food will come improved human and ecological health outcomes. So the idea here is that basically by using the market, for better or for worse, economics and economic markets are powerful forces in today's day and age. If we can support people in choosing what's better, that will incentivize the market then to focus on nutrition as opposed to volume and aesthetic. Achievements and momentum. From 2017 to 2021, the BI accomplished this confirmed the scale of nutrient variation, its connection to causal factors, and the feasibility of non-invasive instruments, confirming phase principles 1 to 3 in the previous section. 2021 to 2025, principles 4 and 5. The BI confirmed a biomarker-based 1 to 100 scale in beef, galvanizing international interest and support. Those are what we think we've done. Next one. There, almost. Almost there. Yep. Oh, there we go. Treaty objectives. 2026 to 2028. The success of this treaty will develop nutrient density definitions in 20 of the most globally significant crops by the end of 2028. Engage allies from a diverse spectrum of perspectives across the food system and shaping, refining, and implementing the methodology to define nutrient density in food. And we'll publish a data set of universally recognized definitions for nutrient density in food and maintain an open metadata framework sharing causal factors to support all growers in best opportunities to optimize the nutritional caliber of the food they produce. Okay, great. Number 7, this speaks to the series of global listening sessions that we're initiating right now. I mentioned this before. Public events will be held to launch the treaty and collect feedback in Australia in September 2025, Europe and North America in October 2025, North America, South America, and Africa in November 2025. For whatever reasons, we have yet to have any meaningful engagement in Asia. So we're just going to have to hope that by going through 5 of the world's continents and engaging people, that will provide sufficient perspective to do a good job here. Participation is open to all of goodwill, including researchers, agronomists, farmers, technologists, consumers, funders, NGOs and thought leaders, institutions, government bodies, and companies. A minimum of 100 global co-signatories from across these constituencies is sought to confer legitimacy and justification for implementation and funding of this endeavor. I truly do hope that we have hundreds and hundreds of people that sign on to this, thought leaders, organizations, agronomists, researchers, chefs, nutritionists, people from government agencies, etc. Anybody who wants to engage now and go to the website and sign on, just so you know what you're signing on to is that you are participating in the process. You're saying, I, so-and-so, we, this organization, etc., are, want to be understood to be taking part in this process. That's different than when we have a final treaty. When people are taking part in the process, we're going to be welcoming their insight and their suggestions. Our target is that by the end of November, after we've completed these listening sessions around the planet, we'll have a final draft. And at that point, anybody who wants to put their name on it would be a signer of the treaty. So right now, if you're associated with it, it's a participant. And after November, when we've got a final draft, this would be you're a signatory to the treaty. That's how we're envisioning this process. Public events will be held to launch the treaty and collect feedback. Ooh, that's again, it looks like a typo there on Article 8. This should be a funding, I should say, talk about the funding. Phase 1, we anticipate we'll need about $5 million to do all the work necessary in 2026. So we're targeting raising that by January 1st. Phase 2, we think we'll need about $8 million to accomplish the work in 2027. So we want to have those commitments in place to start the work to be able to run that aspect of the effort. And then phase 3, we think it'll be $13 million or thereabouts to finish the efforts during January 2028. So the idea is, and this is a lesson we learned from doing the beef project, to line up all your funding ahead of time. We started the beef project. We're like, oh, we got $250,000. Let's get going. And we spent that money, and we didn't have the rest of the money lined up. And yeah, we had to lay people off because we just ran out, and we had to go raise more money, and then we could rehire staff. And that happened a couple of times with the beef project. So a really big and important piece of this process after concluding the treaty is to line up all the resources. We want to basically be having these commitments in escrow. So when we complete the metrics associated with phase one, that money for phase two is there and committed, and we don't need to worry about it. But this is the scale of funding we're looking at. We hope that through the momentum of people engaging in this process and signing on, we'll be able to inspire the funders necessary to actually bring this kind of money to bear. We're targeting January 1st to begin this process, but that's an internal deadline. The reality is we're not going to start until we've got the treaty finalized and the funds identified and on hand, committed to do this job and do it comprehensively. These funds will support experimental design and representative sample collection from across 6 continents, lab analysis, and requisite human health correlation trials, data housing, processing, publication, and dissemination. That's the use of funds. Experimental design framework. The initiative will follow a model refined through the BI's Beef Nutrient Density Project, key design principles. This is original research. Conclusions will emerge from pattern recognition in the data. We're not going to put our finger on the scale and say, we think this is the answer. We're going to let the data guide us. Global sampling, all major production regions on 6 continents will be represented. Inclusive metadata, production, management history, soil type, genetics, epigenetics, pest and disease pressure, climate data, production economics data will all be collected and assessed. So we're looking at a full spectrum of environmental conditions. We're looking for multi-dimensional forms of assessment. So we're looking at the crops themselves. We're looking at the soil, microbiome, human health responses to the consumption of this food. All these metrics will be assessed. We're committed to transparency and open access. All data sets will be publicly available to engage, to enable replication and innovation. I think this is a really important point. The idea here is that whatever we come up with at the end of this process will be the first ever nutrient density definition, but won't be the last. We hope this is a process that is improved upon year on year. We hope that we inspire major government agencies and a global collaboration to spend probably the hundreds of millions or even billions of dollars necessary to have much more nuanced definitions of nutrient density going forward. We do not expect this to be the final be all and end all. We think this is a first solid stake in the ground, which says, here's a different way of looking at food. Let's see if we can organize ourselves as society in this kind of a fashion to improve the process going forward. Proposed timelines per crop. The first 3 months is experimental design. The next 12 months is sample collection. As I said before, looking both at the northern and southern hemispheres. Lab assessment, that should say 6 months instead of 12 months there for lab assessment. 3 months expert review and initial standard development. And then finally, the last 6 months, writing and publication of papers to formalize the conclusions in the peer-reviewed literature. All right. I think there's one more. Yep. Implementation and publication. Upon completion of analysis for each crop, the BI will establish preliminary nutrient density definitions in a 1 to 100 scale format. We'll share all metadata, including spectral signature data, which could be used to calibrate instruments for assessment, as well as production data for producers to be able to improve their crops. So we want to make it so that anybody who is looking to improve the quality of the food they're producing has as much information as possible to understand how to shift their practices to get these results. What are likely to be the things they could do differently to empower them? We're not wanting people to be embarrassed from wanting people to be empowered to do a better job. As well, we want to support anybody who wants to build meters that can be used to test this, not just for people that are buying food, but for agronomists, for packing houses, for wholesalers, for retailers. We're going to need instrumentation across the entire supply chain to measure this and to support the market and coordinating around quality. So as much as we can do to support everybody who's going to be in the business of the food in implementing these insights, that's our job. We want to publish findings in reputable peer-reviewed journals, and we're going to advocate for industry adoption and alignment with public health policy. Obviously, we understand there are significant issues with human health, chronic disease globally. These insights, we hope, will be able to be taken and brought forward into those conversations. We have 4 appendices, which crops we're prioritizing, a methodological summary of the sampling protocol, a timeline and milestone chart, and the funding prospectus and use of funds. These are appendices which are for those who want to go into much greater depth. I don't think we probably should touch on these now, Shauna. We've used our hour, which is usually defined for the presentation form of this conference. Now I'd like to step into the conversation component. I've talked to Su Kahumbu, who's going to be speaking at our conference and one of the subsequent presentations, and invited her to be the panelist who asks me questions. We're hoping to have at least one of these listening sessions in Nairobi in Kenya, and hoping to set that up. It'll probably be in the second half of November. So let's see if we can. Oh, there she is. Beautiful. Welcome, Sue, to the conversation. For obviously a number of you who are in attendance are from Africa, and you all know Sue. You've come through her amazing work on the continent, digesting the insights of people in the biological system and converting it into classes that have been shared with many, many hundreds of producers in Africa. So we're really happy to welcome you, Sue, to the Soil and Nutrition Conference stage, and I'm looking forward to the interrogation, if I may say so, or just maybe it'll just be a conversation. One last thing I would say, there's a bunch of comments in the chat. We welcome everyone's questions to be part of this conversation. The request is please put any questions you'd like asked of me into the Q&A box. Do not put them in the chat box. The chat box is for you all to talk to each other and share anything that you want to be questions you want to be asked or comments engaged publicly. Put those in the Q&A box so it's easier for us to just track those. But welcome, Sue.
Great, thanks, Dan. Thank you so much for having me on the show today. Your conference today, and I just want to say hi to all the iCows out there. It's always great to see you. I love how intrigued and interested you all are in topics of nutrition. For those of you that don't know how Dan and I met, and that will include some of you as my students and others in the audience, Dan was so gracious with how he allowed us to come to the conference. When I read about the nutrient density, the soil conferences, I reached out to him and I said, Africa's not on the map. We're not there. How can we get there? And most of my students, I said, would not be able to afford the fees to join. And we discussed it, and Dan said, well, they can just make a slight contribution then towards them. We brought the cost down to make it affordable for all of the students. And then a sponsor, when he heard about the conversation we had, he said, I'll sponsor 100 of your students to go. And this is our second year. The application, the sponsor sponsored it again this year as well. And we had far more than 100 who applied. So it was just 100 lucky that got in. And then after that, as we started listening to Dan's work, I just thought, this is nuts. My course talked about regenerative agriculture, it talked about the missing parts around soils and soil microbiology, but we didn't have that nutrient part or the mineral part. And I asked Dan if he would, if I could use his material or if he would join the class. And he just jumped in straight away and said, I want to talk to Africa. I want to talk to your students. Let me, help me, get me there.
Is it like
And
that?
exactly. That's what it was like. It was just like, I mean,
It's
Dan,
true.
I want to thank you because it's been absolutely mind-blowing and a huge learning for all of us. And I take your information now. In fact, conferences all over this country, people are beginning to, we've just got the word nutrient density actually embedded last week in our extension documentation with the government. It was always about food security. Now we have food and nutrient density security. So they're beginning to get the message based on what we've learned from you, the systems
Congratulations.
start changing slowly.
Testament to you, Sue. That's no,
No, a
that's
testament
no,
to you.
that's no small effort. And well, yeah.
Um,
Either way,
it's phenomenal.
it takes a village. It takes a village.
It
All
takes a
right. It's
village, and you
model of
carry a very
nature,
good village.
collective symbiosis. Yeah.
Yeah. So the work that you're doing, I mean, almost single-handedly, just creating this massive shift around nutrients. Before I start asking you questions around the treaty, which is fabulous that we've got there, I would just want to ask you, when did it start for you and what drove you to get this embedded in following this as your North Star, making sure that we get healthy food systems for the planet?
Uh, it's a long answer. I think, in all truth, it really started when I was in my early 20s. And I had been spending a bunch of time up in the Himalayas, sort of what I say is getting my master's degree in the science of the East. Um, we have a science of the physical plane in the West, but there's a science of the multiple other planes in the East that's many thousands of years old, and we don't talk about in the West. And so I'd spent a couple winters up in the Himalayas, uh, practicing the techniques from the Vedas and the Tantras, and all these meditation techniques, etc. And I'd gotten to a point where um, my body basically couldn't handle the intensity of the prana, the life force that was flowing through it. And as someone who was young and healthy, I'd grown up on an organic farm. I'd eaten lots of fresh vegetables and grass-fed meat and whole grains, and you would think that I would be healthy and strong, and relatively speaking, I was. But when it comes to the intensity of consciousness and what's the potential of our bodies to be and to do, I was entirely insufficient, unfit. I couldn't handle it. And so I got to thinking about, you know, the body as a vessel for spirit, um, and realized that for spirit to really become fully manifest in my body, it needed to be more well. And so that was the essence of it, was looking around, and literally from the mountaintop, from up in the Himalayas, looking down at humanity, and seeing all of our struggles and woes, and understanding that we don't actually vibrate at a particularly high level. There's a lot of difficulty, a low vibe, low energy consciousness, and I thought that if we could increase the quality of the food supply, if we could create a dynamic where people's bodies were vibrating more coherently because what they were being built out of was better, and we get a new body every 6 months effectively, that if our bodies were more whole, were more resonant, were more coherent, then our higher um, natures could become more manifest, could come through us to a greater degree more of the time, and rather than be um, angry or frustrated with the political system or the economic system or the education system or the media system or I mean, there's all kinds of structures of culture that many people have justifiable critiques about. My comment is those structures of culture are made out of humans. humans make those
Yeah.
systems, and if those humans are vibrating out of tune, if we're unable to ground our higher natures, you shouldn't expect those systems of culture to be, inspired. And so if we can create a dynamic where ambient level of food is for everyone is better, we expect then everyone would become more well, and
Yeah.
that would give us a foundation for our culture to be more whole. So yeah, that's hopefully a
And
short answer
that's where
to
your
a long.
journey started. Whilst you
Yeah.
were saying that, I was just thinking about all the trouble in the world today. And part of what you were just saying made me just think, I wonder how much of it is driven by bad food systems. Because how can people be thinking, as you're saying, and behaving in a more spiritual and conscious and healthy way if food systems are so broken? Is that why we're seeing humanity literally deteriorating even in our communities around us, politics, you name it, all of that? Is food underpinning all of this as well? Because we sometimes just think that it's just politics, but then why do people follow the politics?
If anybody's ever raised children and they've seen what happens to kids when you give them candy, um, it's pretty quick. You give them junk, they go up, they get hyper, and then they crash and they turn into little shits. Um, you know, I mean, you give them a balanced diet. Obviously, they need to feel safe, they need to feel loved. You
Yeah.
probably shouldn't be raising your voice. They shouldn't be exposed to inappropriate influences. But literally, you eat junk and you start to act out and you start to get depressed. And it's really, pretty
And adults,
a lot of improvement could happen if if we just
yeah, and a lot of adults, and we
know,
are just grown up kids at the end of the day, just
well,
to be
for,
really,
for adult children. Yeah, what do they say? Yeah, exactly. You can have an adult
yeah,
body, but that doesn't mean you have a level of wisdom and maturity. That's two different things. Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
Okay. Well, that's amazing. So getting to know a little bit more about what got you here and what drives you, it's just phenomenal because you're again, we're speaking to you from Australia, and I know that it's so hard. Every time I speak to you, you're in another country, you're traveling around, and you're continuing to push out the messages that you are and create the communities. And now you've got to this point of this global treaty, which is just awesome. I want to ask a couple of questions. So, from an African perspective, when we look at your data before and all of the testing that you've been doing, and even when we look at simple things like BRICS readings and stuff with global ones, Africa's largely off the map. We're not looking at our indigenous vegetables, our indigenous crops.
Yeah.
We kind of like we're listening to the conversation, but part of our food systems are not in it yet.
Yeah.
So I know that you've talked about, and one of the reasons we're having a conversation, and you're saying you now want to bring in Africa. You've talked about all of the samples that will be coming up. Is there any way that we can look at co-opting the research institutions on the African continent that have the ability to do the testing? Will it help? Because the time frame you're looking at is quite short, and we do need to fix food systems in a relatively short time frame, or we're trying to. Your projections are 2 years. Would it help if we looked at incorporating some of the institutions on the African continent as doing part of the testing, so that it would then require, I don't know, something like their protocols, and then the planning process would be put out some protocols so that countries can start to follow those protocols and get the data into the system based on testing regionally? Would that work? Is that something that could work?
Yeah, well, I mean, as I said, I think earlier, you know, in a couple of years, we hope to establish a baseline, and, um, you know, the logistics of bringing in samples from 6 continents. We want to make sure Asia is well covered. We want to make sure Africa is well covered. We want to make sure South America is covered. Um, there are some logistical hurdles which have to do with, if you run if you take a sample, cut it in half, send, half of it to one lab and half of it to a different lab, you get different numbers. This is one of
Okay.
those things like it's like
Yeah.
taking a soil
Yeah.
sample. You can
Yeah.
send that same soil sample to three different labs, which all claim to do the same mode of assessment, um, and you get different numbers. And
You
which
just
one?
go with the best one.
And our numbers true. And this is one of the things we're all taught, like our numbers are a real thing. And like, well, is it? What is it? What are we looking at? Are we actually looking at nutrients? Are we looking at vibration? Are we looking at coherence? There's a much deeper conversation about what we're looking at. So, um, I think in my mind, phase one is this, we identify a lab in some country, which gives us a good price, which all the samples can be run through, and that keeps
Okay.
it simple. And that's baseline level one. And we publish our preliminary definition of nutrient density in potatoes or in cucumbers or in wheat. Subsequent to that, as we begin to have this momentum build, I think of it as like the Human Genome Project or any one of these sort of big, global endeavors. Like this is a complex question,
Yeah.
which
Yeah.
really
Yeah.
properly deserves the focus and effort of national scale research institutes.
Yeah.
Um, and so I would think, I mean, if it's possible to bring these national level research funding agencies and structures in place in a short time frame, like a couple of years, which seems like it's not a short time frame, but for these kind of entities, it is a short time frame.
Yeah.
If that's possible, I'm completely open to it. Um,
Got it. Get it.
completely open.
So
But
what I hear you
ideally,
saying
it's
is,
going to be iterating.
yeah, yeah. So
Yeah.
what I hear you saying is that looking at doing things in a way that there would be no question about the data, would be running it all through the same place to begin with, so that we don't end up with any of those variables. And that makes sense. Okay, so when you talk
And
about the actual products,
well, just what
so
we say, if we're doing something like 25 million
yeah,
for 20 crops, that's like
yeah,
extraordinarily inexpensive. Even though 25
okay,
million sounds like a lot of money,
yeah, yeah,
that's like bare bones, highly efficient, minimum numbers of samples to establish the baselines to get
yeah,
effective outlines. Really, this is the kind of thing that could be a 20 or 50 or $500 million per crop kind of
yeah,
thing. I
yeah,
mean, compared to what other kind of stuff is looked at and researched, you could argue this is
yeah,
completely worthy of that. But
yeah. So another question comes to the choice of the products, because you mentioned that you'll be looking at about 20 products, and the choice of the products. And I want to put Kenya on the map here because of some of the data that I've been looking at recently. We're looking at stunting in childhood stunting, which is high. We've
yeah,
looked at nutrition being, well, we're not, the jury's out where this is coming from. But if we look at our staple foods, as an example, it might not be the same staple that, for example, that are in the States or in Europe or other places. So with a view to making sure that your sample size is representative across all these different continents, what are your thoughts and what might the process look like in terms of what products would be chosen to be studied in those countries? What do we need to do to help you get there, to help
this
you
is
make it relevant for us?
right. Thank you. This is exactly why, as we were discussing earlier, I want to have these listening sessions in every continent because there are different concerns and logistical issues in every continent. And me as a North American, I just don't know. I don't know what the constraints and the concerns and the logistical things are in Africa. And so the more I'm able to engage Africans and say, tell us what is important to you, because otherwise we don't know. This is why we want to do this. Um, there were four appendices, which I asked Shauna not to walk us through because I thought we'd walked through enough slides already. One of them is the list of proposed crops to be assessed. So this, what I would say is um, go to the website, give us your name, say, I want to be part of this process, and submit your proposal for this crop or that crop or that crop, and give us a rationale. This is exactly what we want to be doing right now, is we want to be listening to people from around the world who say, you're not looking at pigeon pea and you really should, or I don't even know what crops you would suggest for Africa. I have no idea. Um, But
Got it.
that
So,
list of what the things are we're going to be looking at is a completely open and fungible right now. I'm
yeah,
not attached
okay,
to anything.
okay.
Yeah.
So to the iCow soil advocates here, you might all have ideas of what you think should be being studied, and we're from all over the country. Actually, we're not from all over the country, we're from all over the continent.
Yeah.
In here at the moment are some of my students from Zimbabwe, from South Africa, from Kenya, and I'm not sure where else because I can't see all the names, but you might all have different ideas, and you might all be thinking, well, actually, I know somebody else who might have some ideas because of X or Y in the space they're in. So the go-to is go to the website, sign up, and start the conversation happening, because that is going to determine our interest in the eventual outcome of data. And if we don't become part of the process, they might be studying apples for Kenya, and it won't help. So we've got to get involved.
100%. I mean, the general idea is we want to be looking at foods that are, staples, significant portions of people's caloric intake.
Yeah,
Cilantro is nice, but it's not a priority, right?
yeah,
Like, what are things that are meaningful parts of human diets,
yeah,
in different parts of the world, and that we can begin to characterize these definitions for. There's many, many more than 20 foods that are eaten by humanity, but if you look at the
yeah,
total intake, of humans, you could identify 20 foods that are probably 85 or 90% of the total caloric intake. So let's look at that. We
So
do
what
want to
if,
balance that with, like, we want to have enough different beans and legumes. We want to have grains. We want to have dairy. We want to have meat. We want to have fruits. We want to have roots and leaves. So we want to
yeah,
try to at least have a basic diversity of food types. I don't
yeah,
think we'll probably be looking at herbs, although medicinal plants, although it would be certainly an interesting question. I'm totally
yeah,
open to it. And
yeah,
if we want to do 50 crops, well, then we have to raise more money. So
yeah,
all these
yeah,
things are in all those factors. Yeah.
yeah. Part of my thinking on a personal level would be based on what we're seeing happening with our children. It would be, what are children eating? And I would be like, let's study those things, because that's the beginning. And on that note, what part of the equation, or what part of the process, because we know that there are a lot of pesticide contaminants in our foods. We know that because of the agricultural practices we follow. So I know that we're going to be measuring nutrients, but are we going to also be mapping other things like those, or will they just not be in the equation per se? You know?
This is another great idea that I hadn't thought of that would be a completely legitimate thing to say as part of this listening process.
Yeah,
Please add pesticide residues to the things you're looking at.
yeah,
This is
great.
this is exactly to my point. I'm going to sound like a like a broken record. The reason we're doing this is because different people have different ideas, and if the general consensus is we really want to know about the relationship between nutrient levels and toxins,
Yeah,
and that's really important. Okay, let's do that.
yeah,
Let's understand the budgetary implications of it. And I
yeah,
mean, all of these things are, if human health trials, okay, great. Well, human health trials we think are pretty important, but they're also really expensive. So how do we figure out ways to ensure we're doing that within a budgetary, range? And so we want to take in the questions, we take in the ideas, and we also want to be having them grounded in practical proposals, like here is a pesticide scan that you can do that costs X number of dollars, or I don't even know what your form of currency is in Kenya. Um,
shillings.
Shillings.
Yeah.
Yeah. So,
And
uh,
sometimes just wishful thinking.
what's that?
Shillings and wishful thinking.
And heart and
No, exactly. So,
goodwill.
so I think that again, when I look at how we can contribute, we should then look internally at our food systems, see where the problems are. All of us have got different reasons that we're here. Part of it might be we want to know the pesticide residues, we want to see the hormonal residues, we want to see antibiotic residues, we want to see all of that stuff that's in our food, because even if you defined it based on nutrients and the nutrients were low, if we don't know what is driving that and what else would be affecting us. There's no point in saying, yeah, you've got food that is better nutritionally, but it's still stacked with antibiotic residues. We're still a bit stuffed. So we need to really consider that.
Brilliant. Brilliant.
I was going to ask you, where do we sign up? But we now know where we sign up. And yeah, I guess to get the ball rolling in the interim is us guys. No, that was another question to you. In terms of bricks, I know we're going to talk about this later, but do you still see space for bricks to be starting the ball rolling while all of this is rolling out? Bricks readings.
Yeah, well, let this be the moment when we share with the attendees that we have something that we're going to be launching here. That's a complete exciting project, which is the the session of this conference that you're formally scheduled to be part of, with refractometers.
Should we talk about it now, or should we make them wait?
I think we should just sort of let people know there's something exciting coming and not tell them what it is.
Okay, you go ahead. You can tell them.
I completely think that refractometers are a critical piece of this equation, and they are the thing we have now. And it's all well and good to work on some big grand vision and global definitions and ray guns and all kinds of stuff. But the refractometer is a really simple, very inexpensive. We've already got it. We've already got a scale for it thing, and so. Yeah, we are working together to create a dynamic by which refractometers can be used to help people assess the nature of their supply chains now. And we'll be releasing that here at this conference as a global release sometime very soon. Yeah. So how's that? Does that sound that covers it?
That was good. That was good.
People kind of know we're up to something, but they don't quite know what it is, but they kind of look, read between the lines, they can understand it. Yeah.
And I think that what we'll be what that will help us with is understanding how big the scale of nutrient variation is as defined by BRICS across Africa, something that we've not got yet, to even start saying, well, part of me, the other day, not the other day, but one of my students sent me there were pigeon peas. And when I bricked them, they were like 25.5. And that stopped me dead in my tracks. I'm like, this is nuts. And I'm like, okay, why is it so high? And then, of course, my brain goes off down a gazillion rabbit holes all at the same time. One of them was, in our rural areas, is one of the reasons we were not so affected by COVID, because our immunity was high, because we've got such diversity of foods with high bricks. Is that something that's not being looked at? Another part of me was saying, hey, we're being ripped off. We're exporting stuff to other parts of Europe that have got really great bricks. We're being paid per kilo, but we should be being paid for nutrients, because that's what we need for nourishing ourselves. So I'm hoping that we can start at least looking and seeing what is the difference, where are the variables, and what are the opportunities in there as well that help us with our markets beyond Kenya. As I mentioned to you before, I mean, nutrients don't know boundaries. You probably had some food in Australia today that could have originated in Kenya, for all we know.
Well, and I was on a bunch of farms and have been across, Australia the past number of days, and they're growing a lot of foods which are not endemic to this continent. And, what were the Aboriginal people raising? And it evolved on this continent, in this soil, in this climate. And is it inherently much more nutritious for people who are living here? And just because you bring in a crop from somewhere else doesn't mean that it's optimally evolved to grow there. And, is there some powerful wisdom of, we shouldn't all be eating wheat and chicken, whatever. Corn is nice, but it's corn. Should corn be a staple, or a maize? Should that be a major part of the diet in Africa? Or are there other things that are much, much more, nutritious and optimal? They just don't fit well into the industrial production model.
Yeah.
Uh, so yeah,
And then
there's a
from a,
whole bunch of rabbit holes that are totally exciting to be going down, and
yeah,
yeah, like I said, a small organization, but hopefully beginning to continuing to facilitate a deeper dive into all this. I will say we've entered the last half hour of our 2 hour session, and so this is the point when I like to try to emphasize that we prioritize the Q&A that people have put into
perfect.
the box. So if you wouldn't mind reading those, and I'll answer them, and then if there's time left and you want to keep asking questions, that's great. But let's make sure that the attendees can get a chance to.
Yes. So Maita asks, she says, is there any definition or standard defined by the FAO in relationship of their nutrient density or any interest expressed?
No, there is not a definition. I certainly, I've been speaking at a couple of conferences here in Western Australia in the past week, and um, you know, in the last week, I've had a few people say, "Hey, I'm connected to the FAO. This is what you're doing is something that they should be involved in. They would be excited about. Have you talked to them yet?" I said, "No, I haven't. The way I get around is by introductions. So if you think you know anybody there who would be receptive, please, here's my card, here's my email, here's my phone number. Please feel free to introduce them." Yeah, ideally, this is what the FAO and the UN ecosystem
Should
is
be
designed to
doing.
do as part of this. We are a small NGO, and I do not want to have the end game be like we're the ones running this for the planet. It would be wonderful if we had these entities that are designed to be accomplishing this work, owning it. As with a lot of government bureaucracies, FAO is a bureaucracy. There are a lot of people who are trained in the reductionist paradigm in places of power in these structures, and sometimes holistic concepts like this are threatening to those structures. So I'm not gonna hold my breath about the receptivity, engagement, and willingness to take this on holistically, but I'm extremely receptive. I would be very happy to go back to farming and
No, 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 no. Dan's
application.
not going back to farming. We're not, you're, you're
Dan could
far
have
more
a more
important
balanced
here.
personal life and not be on the
You're
road
far,
here.
you're
Yeah,
far more important here, and I'll tell you why. Dan, how long has your organization been around for?
15 years.
15 years, okay? 15 years, and you're making headway in nutrient density, which is the essence of what food is about. It's the essence of what nourishes our cells. The FAO has been around for 80 years. What the hell have
Okay.
they been doing?
I don't even know. I don't pay attention. I'm
I
single-mindedly focused
mean,
on what I'm
so,
doing, and
so,
I
so
don't pay attention to anything else.
yeah. So I Googled that quickly and I just thought, hang on a second, can you imagine Dan at 8 years old? How this planet will have changed in terms of food systems if we can keep him doing what he's doing. So you just stay where you are and keep doing what
I
you're
say
doing,
in
Dan.
5 years we got this thing done. I'm pretty sure if we just stay focused, we can get this pretty well dialed in less than five.
Oh,
We'll give
how
it 5 years.
exciting.
I
Totally exciting.
it's not that far out. We have all the pieces we need.
Yeah.
Yeah, the moment is massive.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And passion. We've got passion, which is great. Now that brings me to the next question. Well, it's more a statement actually. 5 years and you need to eat your food slowly because Dr. Christmas Doherty says that Dan, the food you eat slowly becomes the subtle essence of your mind. So you eat your food slowly going forward, okay? We
Good
need
to hear.
your minds.
Christopher's one of the founding board members of the BFA. He was around in 2008, 2009. I might augment that slightly. I mean, my understanding is, yeah, certainly speed of eating is important, but I would say state of mind or state of heart is also exquisitely important. So you can slowly eat and be angry and get indigestion, or you could slowly eat with joyful conversation and
Yeah.
have it sort of powerfully nourish you. So in the past couple of years, I have in my own, lexicon, I've expanded the definition of food to go beyond the physical substance we ingest to also include the emotional substance,
Mm.
the intellectual substance, the ideas we're exposed to, the ideas we're cogitating on, the feelings we're exposed to, the feelings we're projecting. I think, I mean, we're going to be talking at this conference about Wi-Fi and 5G and the electromagnetic, energy that we're taking in. Are you outside in the sunlight? Are you inside under, horrible
Yeah,
lights?
yeah,
Um,
yeah,
all kinds of things are affecting us simultaneously, and the physical substance is one thing. And even that, if you take a beautiful, I don't know, tomato, amazing, fresh, beautiful, flavorful tomato, and you irradiate it, you flash it with radiation, you
yeah,
do profoundly detrimental things to the resonant harmonic frequency of the water in it, which is what's holding these octaves of coherence. And the nutrients may still be there, the vitamin C and the, tocopherol and the whatever it is, lycopene, but it's not vibrating in the same harmonic. So it's a
yeah,
much deeper conversation when I say we're hiding behind biochemistry to start this conversation, but really it's a much deeper one. So yes, Christopher, absolutely. Eat slowly, eat with family and friends joyfully, I would
yeah.
say as
And I
well.
would take that even
Are
to
you, are you cooking it with love or are you
exactly,
angry? All these
exactly.
things I
That's the
think are
whole
really,
thing.
really important. Yes, I digress. Sorry.
Yeah. No, 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 no. You shouldn't digress. And I'm hoping that one of the
I
sessions
did
will be
digress.
with some great chefs. I think you
Yeah.
one session with some great chefs, because cooking is a really enjoyable thing when you take time to say you're producing food for your friend and families. And in the busy rush of life, we just kind of like chuck stuff together or buy stuff. But when you're cooking and you get into it, yeah, it's amazing. It's
I
a
find when I really cook for people, like I'm not hungry afterwards. Like I
yeah,
literally I have no desire to eat. I literally am full. I feel satiated from the act of cooking. Like I'll make a big nice meal, 3, 4, 5 courses, set it down, bunch of people there, and I'm like, I don't want to eat. And I think it's real. I think it's totally real.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, amazing, amazing.
Anyway,
So, on to another question. As a nutrient density scale moves towards the public, how can we present the results so people stay curious and inspired without sparking panic, turning it into a passing fad, or discarding perfectly good-looking foods that test lower and risking needless food waste while nutrient levels scale up?
that's an important question.
Mm,
Um, well, I guess, I mean, um, maybe what that presumes is that all of a sudden everybody on the planet is going to be paying attention to what we're doing. Um, and that I like to think I'm up to something important, but I'm pretty damn sure most people on the planet are not paying attention to what I'm doing. So um, I would guess that it'll start with 0.1% and then 0.5% and then 1% of the populace that are beginning to pay attention to this stuff and talking about it. Um, one thing I can say, and I can say this, from a lot of things that are happening in the last, really, I would say 6 months,
mm,
is that there's some really big, really, really, really big food companies that are, from what I can tell, seriously wanting to completely transform their supply chains. Um, we've been slowly, gently talking about this for long enough, and the buzz has been building, and the legitimacy is there. And I mean, I'm completely impressed over the years when, or recently, people who tell me that are in places of significant authority and power in big corporates. Like I've been listening to your conference for years, Dan, and I'm like, I'm sorry, who are you? Like, did you just give me your job description? Like, I think I know you've been watching our conference and like, yeah, we're tracking you and we see what's coming down the pike and we understand what you're talking about is real. We understand that this kind of instrumentation is there. We've done our market research. We understand this is what people want. Like people want food that's better for themselves and their families. And
Yeah.
businesses stay in business when they give their customers what they want.
Yeah.
And so a lot of these really big food companies are saying, we've done our market research. Our customers want food that is flavorful, is nutritious. They want it to be inexpensive, but they want it to be flavorful and they want it to be nutritious. And so they are working behind the scenes to completely systemically shift their supply chains. And so that to me is the exciting opportunity is
Yeah.
if we roll this out gently and we do it thoughtfully and we do it
Yeah.
openly, support and engage anybody and everybody in the process, um, the companies that are producing your food and whether it's good or bad, that there's massive multinational food corporations,
Yeah.
they do have a big footprint. And if they say, hey, we want all of our apples and potatoes and onions and garlic and lettuce to be better,
Yeah.
we know with agronomy how to do that. We know,
Yeah.
from presenters who've been to this conference, like they have agronomy companies. They can work and they are working on massive scale. Behind the
Yeah.
scenes, really big changes happening. I was just talking to a farmer here in Western Australia a few hours ago, and he raises 100 acres of lettuce for what's called QSR. I didn't know what QSR stood for a couple months ago. Quick service restaurants. That's like Burger
Right.
King and McDonald's and Hungry Jack's and whatever, whatever, whatever. And
Yeah.
he's like, you know, um, and he was like, can you help me? He just finished. I did a 2-day course. He's wanting to improve his fertility program, get a better quality. He's got issues with disease and pests. Like, okay, pest and disease resistance equals nutrient density, equals carbon sequestration, equals flavor, equals shelf life. And we were talking about it out in the field today. He's like, yeah,
Yeah.
the agricultural production system is transforming right now.
Yeah.
It's
And
a
yeah.
really happy story.
Yeah, and I guess what we're also saying is that it's not gonna all shift like boom, and I don't think that people are gonna panic because or panic that much. Yes, we should already be panicking, quite frankly, because we're seeing the destruction and the how terrible the systems are as we speak. So we should rather than be panicking, we should be just looking forward and saying, okay, we know it's going to be a slow transition. The fact is, when it comes in and it's profitable for farmers, it'll just become hopefully become lean more towards the norm than right now the norm being the other way. So
I would say I don't think it's necessarily going to be slow. I think there's every reason to think that it could be actually quite rapid,
well, I
that the
hope you're
global
right.
supply chain transforms.
Yeah.
All the pieces are in place. All the
Yeah,
pieces are there. It's really quite
I,
exciting.
I, I guess because you're seeing it from a consumer's perspective, and I'm seeing it from a production perspective. So I'm seeing it from the farmers in Kenya as an example. For the shift to actually happen, where we've got most of our agriculture is and the agricultural systems and regulations and accreditations and the extension system, etc., is roped into well, it's devolved, but government. So
Yeah.
the change needs to happen at that level for us to believe that it could happen quickly. It needs to be systemic within government systems. Whereas on the consumption side, driving it from, say, for example, Europe, or the US, I just think that the market sizes are bigger, the access to the information and the change, I think, will come faster than it might come here if we don't engage government, which is why I say we must start engaging our national government into the
Yes.
conversations that we're having now so that they can see and work with that. Yeah. So
And
Chanya, that
every
was,
every every place has its own dynamics, and
yeah,
every people in their place know their place and their dynamics. And
yeah,
that's the point of a biological system is we're engaging in symbiosis and we're supporting each
yeah,
other who each have our own unique attributes in success based on our milieu. Yeah.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
this is, I mean, and I really do want to, I mean, you're right. When you gave me the opportunity to engage people in Africa, I got really excited. I'm like, it's a big place and there's lots of people and things aren't really could be a lot better. And we have so much knowledge that could totally help so many people. Oh my God, how much fun. Please, yes,
Dan's
let
on
me tell,
fire. Dan's on
let me
fire.
help.
Where's the fire emoji? Hang on.
Looks
Okay.
like rocket ships.
I tell you, you're octane, high octane. To the next
Oh,
question.
hi, okay, okay. It's like rocket ships? What's that have to do with anything? Yeah.
Tom Fisher says, will the treaty require testing crops grown on virgin soils? Highest nutrient density should come from virgin soils that have never been farmed or ranched with pesticides, herbicides, or chemical fertilizers. For example, the hill region of Kansas should produce the highest quantity of beef.
Um, well, I would say anybody who says should has a agenda. Um, and the point of original research in science is you don't have any finger on the scale, and what you're trying to do is survey as broad a diversity of dynamics as possible and see what the data tells you. We can have our thesis.
Yeah.
What I really want to try to accomplish is we are surveying the global supply chain, and we're getting samples from areas that we think are going to be at each edge
Yeah.
of the continuum. What's the most atrocious environment? What's the best environment? Um, I'm already thinking through the logistics of how do we do that, because we have limited resources, limited numbers of samples per crop. How are we going to differentiate? Lots of people say, hey, can I send something in? Can I send something in? And we're going to have some scale of discernment about which samples we choose to assess. For me, something like bricks is really nice. I'm going to say, like, we're only going to be able to take in 40 carrot samples or maybe 35 from Europe. We're going to want to get some really bad ones, and we're going to get some really good ones. We've got a bunch of farmers in Europe that are part of the regenerative movement. They're all going to want to send in carrot samples. We're going to have to be able to say, we want you to get the ones in that are going to help us define the edge of the spectrum of best. If you don't have a Brix reading in the leaf of your carrots at this level, we're not going to
So
provide
we're
you that
not
opportunity
playing, yeah,
in for free. And
yeah,
so this is a totally good question. What are the dynamics? What are the edge cases? All these dynamics, we completely welcome them. That's why we have the form on the page, which says, make your suggestions. Um, you know, a virgin hill country soil in Kansas, I don't know. Um, what's the diversity of plants? What's the mineral ratio? Just because it hasn't been tilled doesn't mean it's not inherently denuded soils. I mean, maybe Kansas is better than somewhere else, but yeah, it's such there's so many rabbit holes to go down and
yeah,
through.
yeah,
Um, but in general, I like to phrase these questions more as like, this might be or this could be instead of this
yeah.
should be. Because when you start to say this should be, then it feels like you've got your opinion involved, and we're trying to step back from
Yeah.
that
And
method.
and when you're dealing with, yeah, I mean, just about everything that I've ever dealt with in my soil lab, when I'm just like, I know exactly what, and then I'm just like, it's completely different. Biology just
Really?
throws a bit
No.
every second. And then
I'm
Dan, you know,
biodynamic. My stuff is great. Oh, it's not. I'm a
anyway,
local farmer. My stuff is great. No, no.
here's a big one for me, Dan, is that you think that you're going to have a call across all these countries, and then you're going to be able to make like 35 samples of carrots. You're going to end up with thousands of opportunities and people wanting to send you samples. It's just going to go, it's going to explode. So it's going to be interesting.
There's no
What
question
you're
about
saying
the
is,
desire to send in samples. The
yeah,
question is about the size of the checkbook to run samples.
yeah, yeah,
I mean, I would love to run thousands of samples, and that's what
yeah,
should happen. It should be a much, much larger research project, but
yeah,
it's a question of cash.
yeah. Do you
Have
think, what
so,
if you attract big money? Would you just change that sample size?
yeah,
Because that could happen, right?
we're trying to design it for minimum viable product. What
Yeah,
would be the fewest number of
perfect.
samples to do a preliminary definition of nutrient density that would be rock solid, that would be, unimpeachable by any skeptic.
Yeah,
That's how we're envisioning designing this right now. And, I think we've raised like maybe $4 or $5 million over the past 7 or 8 years for all the research we've done right now so far. And so to
yeah.
go from 4 million over 8 years to 25 million in the next 4 months, like that's an inflection point. So if it's 50 million or 100 million we can raise, are we
Yeah.
going to look at 20 crops? Or are we going to look at 50 crops? Are we going to look at 20 crops more deeply? I mean,
So back in the
I'm open
ballpark
to
for
people's
us,
feedback
guys.
and suggestions. What's
Yeah,
that?
and I hope that then all of us with influence on the African continent can start pushing, perhaps if we want to be more relevant, then we might even be in positions to find funding that needs to go into that as well. And if we are, let's make it happen, because we do
I
want to
know
be.
there's a lot of people like EU money that's focused on Africa. And,
Yeah,
if there's a bottom-up desire from Africa that says, hey,
yeah,
we want this, and there's a
yeah,
lot of funders in the EU who are supporting Africa with big checks.
yeah,
And if you've got a social movement that bubbles up and says, this is important to us,
yeah,
that would certainly be extremely helpful when going to the foundations and philanthropies in the EU.
yeah,
Obviously, there's people other parts of the world also that are working in funding all kinds of development work in Africa. But it seems like, from my experience, there's a lot of support coming from Europe,
yeah,
wherever it's coming from. If there's a
yeah.
bottom-up desire from Africa saying this is important to us, that would be really helpful and fun. Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. Yeah.
Perfect. We've got 2 questions left and we've got 4 minutes, so let's try and be quick. So Priscilla Nzamalu from Kenya said, I understand that stress is transferable. So eating stressed food, e.g. milk, meat, eggs, can transfer stress to self. What's your take on this, Dan?
Absolutely. Yeah, when we did the beef project, which was our first and only crop we've done a nutrient density definition process so far, we were definitely looking at the stress hormones in the meat as some of the compounds we're looking at. There's no question that's a real thing.
Yeah,
And you brought up the question of whether we're looking at toxins, insecticides, fungicides, things like that, herbicides. Um, there's pro-nutrients, things which are health beneficial, and there's anti-nutrients, things that are health detrimental. And so definitely, as part of the experimental design, looking at determining which the compounds of interest are, this is part of the experimental design process,
yeah,
is what are some of the anti-nutrients we want to be making sure we're looking at as well.
yeah.
100% correct.
Great.
Yeah, 100%
Great.
correct.
So thanks for that, Priscilla. And then Doug Bradley, he has said, last question for the day. In the study, will there be a focus on GMO as opposed to more heirloom varietals?
Yeah, well, so not all foods have GMO versions of them, but absolutely a part of the experimental design is making sure we have a diversity of genetics. We want to
Okay,
have diversity of soil type, a diversity of geography, a diversity of fertility program, management practice. Genetics is one of those pieces we want to be getting.
okay,
So we would absolutely be looking for the crops that do have GMO versions of
yeah,
them, having that be part of it.
yeah.
Yeah,
Perfect. That's
beautiful.
it. We're on time. 2 minutes, Dan. You get
2 minutes
to
left.
close down the session for today. I'll step
Do
out.
you have a final question for us, or I asked you
Um,
to stop because we wanted to go on to these, but maybe you got another one left.
um, No, I don't have any final question, but I do want to say thank you to everybody who's been listening and watching. And go to the site. The link was in there. Dan, maybe we can somehow quickly get this. Somebody had asked for it for the code up on the screen so that they can scan it. I don't
Maybe
know if
Shauna
that
can
can
do
be
that.
yet.
Yeah, it's for people who are willing to type in the URL, it's bionutrientinstitute.org/treaty. That's type it up. There's Shauna. Hey,
There's
Shauna.
Shauna. I'm not a QR code, but the recordings and the emails that come out will have the link to the treaty document and the website. So you can go to the website, or you will be getting another email with those links as well.
Yeah,
Perfect.
really
And
put
that's
in.
a fantastic innovation. Imagine if we were the QR codes of our work. People would just go like that. Okay, Shauna, got it.
She actually showed her face. She doesn't like to be seen on screen and things. But thank you, Shauna, for showing yourself. One of the key, we've got a fairly small team, Shauna and Adam and Sarah, and now Chanya's joining, and it's not that big of an organization, but everything that's happening here at the BFA, certainly I'm the public face, but it wouldn't happen without everybody, and they're all doing critically important things, and we really do have a wonderful team, small but mighty. So
Fantastic.
just if anybody ever makes the mistake of saying this is Dan, no, there's a there's a team here. And Shauna, if you look on our website, everybody else, you can see their face, you can see who they are, and Shauna, she's like hiking on a
Shy.
mountain. You can kind of see her outline. She's like very, very much like does not want to be seen. So that was a big deal to have her show herself there. Thank you, Shauna. But yeah,
Great.
great work. Thank you so much, Sue, for stepping in and doing this. This has been wonderful. Really, really
My
appreciate it.
pleasure, and thank you.